Come, all you moonshiners, if you want to hear.
Oh, welcome back, brewers, distillers, hobbyists, anybody who is just interested in this process. We welcome you again today. We're going to talk about fermentation. If you get an opportunity, of course, subscribe, share us with your friends, comment below. Good, got that out of the way. If you are going to ferment, and that is to create an alcohol that you're going to utilize either in beer, in wine, or in whiskey, it's all done exactly the same way. The only difference is the process of what happens after fermentation is finished. So we're not going to talk about what happens after fermentation is finished. We're going to just cover fermentation itself. Now, there are three basic questions that come up all the time. One of them is, the first question that you normally hear is, how do I know it's done? The second question is, well, what happens if I have a stuck fermentation and in the middle of it, it just stops, but I know it's not finished? And then last but not least, what do I need to do to that fermentation once it's finished? What is secondary fermentation, which is just really a term that brewers and distillers kind of captured. We gave it ourselves. There's no fermentation happening. It's secondary fermentation. We should just call it, we need to just call it what it really is, clarifying, okay, or clearing. So those are the three basic questions that we need to answer today. And we're going to do that through a series of, or just a little bit of a discussion, okay? Now, something I wanted to introduce you to as well is my recent results from a test that I've been conducting on this new product called Angel Yeast. And I've seen this throughout the internet and on different blogs, and I've been kind of tracking it, of course, with a little bit of skepticism, but so I dove in. I was like, okay, let's try that. Now, Angel is a company that makes yeast for a bunch of different processes, okay? So please don't get confused. There is a litany of different types of yeast that Angel develops. And this one in particular is called Starter of Liquor Making, okay? It's Angel Yeast, Starter of Liquor Making. If you ask me about any other yeasts that Angel makes, I don't know. All right, this is the only one that I've been able to mess with up to this point because it took me a while to kind of go through a couple of different stages of testing to find out what the results are. You know that I am a Red Star Distillers Active Dry Yeast, as we call Daddy Yeast, is my all-time favorite. I now have two all-time favorites, and I'll share that with you. And then, of course, Fermax Yeast Nutrient. And I use Fermax Yeast Nutrient on a routine basis, especially for a sugar wash. Because in a sugar wash, there is a lack of nutrients necessary for your yeast to become healthy and happy. So we add additional nutrients. Now, if you're using a grain or you're using fruits or something of that nature, a yeast nutrient is not necessary. It doesn't hurt, but it's not necessary. So let's talk about, yeast dosages. Here is, in a nutshell, okay, it is easier to underpitch and more unlikely to overpitch yeast. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, if you take, and this is some Distillers Active Dry Yeast, if I took probably about 4 or 5 of these grains, it's hard to pick up just one, and I drop them into a 5-gallon bucket, would that amount of yeast ferment that 5 gallons or 21 liters? Would it? Absolutely. Absolutely, yes, it would do that. It may take a long time because, remember, those yeast cells have to bud off and propagate and form daughter cells, and you know that yeast has a reproductive life as well as a chronological life. So you have to get to a point to where you've developed enough for a colony so that colony can start to really go at it. So that is what's known as underpitching. So if you underpitch yeast, chances are it just takes a lot longer for it to take place because you've got to develop this colony. What happens if you put too much yeast in? Well, now we have a situation called survival of the fittest. And it's only going to take as much as it needs in order to develop a colony, and the remainder of that will just fall out and die or become inactive. And yeast, yes, they are cannibalistic, and they will eat dead yeast cells. So that becomes a form of nutrient in itself. All right? So it's a lot easier to underpitch than it is to overpitch. So if you ever have a question and you've put in 2 teaspoons and you wonder, yeah, you could throw another half teaspoon, you won't hurt it. But if you start off and you just put in just a little bit and nothing's happening, you can point your culprit is probably not enough yeast just to even get started. Okay? That ought to clarify that right off the bat. But how do we tell when it's finished? Well, the most obvious answer to that is when it quits bubbling. I've got one here that finished fermenting a couple of days ago, and you'll notice that I've got equal levels of water in this air bubbler. I have no positive pressure whatsoever. So my yeasts are not active. They are not producing any CO2. They are not eating any sugars. There are no sugars left. And so it's not fermenting. That's the easiest answer. But remember, a bubbler is nothing more than an indicator. Okay? It's not a measurement tool. Please don't get confused. The absence of bubbles is not, and I'll say again, is not the clear, surefire answer to not fermenting because there's no bubbles. What happens if you have a leak? And this happens often. You either have a leak around where your bubbler is attached to your fermenter or around the lid of the fermenter. And if that happens, your CO2, that pressure from fermentation, that CO2 that's trying to escape will leave by the path of least resistance. And of course, instead of trying to displace the weight of that water in your bubbler, if it has another avenue to get out, it will escape. So fermentation's happening, but you have no visual indicator. So please don't let that fool you. The only surefire method, we always say that, the only surefire method is to use a hydrometer and measure the gravity over a period of time. Yes, in this particular case, this one measures now all the way down here, right below 1.000, which means that I have more alcohol in here, not more alcohol than water, but I have a level of alcohol that makes this entire container a lower gravity than what water would be. And water would be 1.000. And that is the data point for water. And it's at the very top of your hydrometer. Now, quite briefly, this is a triple scale hydrometer, and these are most popular. Yours doesn't have to be color coded. It doesn't have to have 3 scales. They come in many, many different varieties. But you'll know because it'll have gravity, Brix, and or a potential alcohol by volume scale, which is most useful because the way we work this is it works backwards. Yes, that's the one that gets most people confused. When you drop your hydrometer in and you measure, let's measure this. This is a test jar of water. If I drop my hydrometer in there, and this is a regular beer and wine hydrometer, where should it float? Well, we know it's water, so it should float at the level of water, the data point for water, which is 1.000. And if I drop that in there, lo and behold, there, it floats at 1.000. So I know that that's water. Now, on the other scale that's on here, the percent alcohol, and that is potential alcohol. Percent of potential alcohol in that is also 0. No matter how much yeast I add to that water, I will never create any alcohol. You see where I'm going with that? What am I missing? You have to have sugar, yeast, and water. And in that particular case, I would only have yeast and water, so I can't create any alcohol. That's why it measures at 0. All too often, someone will get in touch with us and say, George, I finished fermenting, I dropped my hydrometer in, and I got 0 alcohol. I got absolutely no alcohol. Well, my first question is always, well, what was your original gravity? Normally, they haven't taken an original gravity because these things read backwards. If your original gravity, well, let's say, for instance, it was 1.090 as an example, it would float all the way up here to about 12, 13% potential alcohol by volume. What that tells you is that, if I add yeast to that and allow that to ferment, potentially I could have 12 or 13% alcohol by volume when it finishes. So you see it reads backwards. Now, after 3 or 4 days, you drop your hydrometer back in there and it reads, let's say, it reads 3% alcohol by volume. Potential. You can go, oh, well, if I take 3 from 13, that means 10. I got 10% alcohol by volume now because I just measured that. I got an additional 3% if I just allow that thing to just continue to ferment. So you see, your hydrometer is the only thing that's going to tell you when it's really done. And when it floats to 1.000 or lower, it is finished. That's how that works. Please, don't confuse these two, because this is the proof and trail hydrometer. What happens if we put a proof and trail hydrometer into water? Well, let's do that. You see how high it floats? It floats all the way up because the scales, it is an extension of this scale. So where 1 stops at the very top, 0 starts on this one on the very bottom. So it's like having these two connected, and this is for pure alcohol, and this is for sucrose, or the gravity of your mash or wash in relationship to what the yeast eat. Don't get them confused. It's easy to get them confused. Once you do, if you drop them in, you're going to get a really wacky reading. You're going to know you got the wrong one. Now, if you're making beer or wine, or you're making a mash for moonshine, you only need this one. Okay? That's the only one you need. Beer, wine, mash, or wash. That's the only one you need. It's called the triple scale hydrometer, standard hydrometer. Now, once you've finished with that and you run it in a still, the additional item you need for that is once you distill that product and you separate that ethanol from the water and you purify it, then you need this one, because this one reads where this one leaves off. So then you need a proof and trail hydrometer. So if you're making beer or wine, these are not useful at all. They don't come in at all, the proof and trail hydrometer. Only your standard hydrometer. Now, what I found out was that using these products, and I did this over several weeks where I did different ferment. That's why I've got these at different stages. In these 3 fermenters, I have a light malt extract, and Have got just a little bit of sugar because I wanted to boost the alcohol content. I'm at 1.080 on the starting gravity. Now these have been at it for about 6 days, so I'm allowing those to go. And what I used in those was I used the angel yeast, and the way I mixed this was I used 15 grams of angel yeast, and I found out that since I did one with angel yeast and I did a sugar wash with just Distiller's Active dry yeast, and then I did an equal amount with Distiller's Active dry yeast and angel yeast mixed together, and I was extremely happy with the results of that. And the results of that were, first of all, in a sugar wash where you would normally have, you know that off odor that we call it, smells like ass, or if it gets really, really bad, smell like 2 asses. That was almost imperceptible when I used Distiller's Active dry yeast and angel yeast together, or when I used just angel yeast. And the only thing I can attribute that to is that your angel yeast comes with alpha and beta amylase and a few other items inside there for some yeast food and some nutrients and things like that, which really turned that fermentation into a very, very effective fermentation as opposed to what we normally experience when we have just a sugar wash. Because remember, in sugar, in table sugar, you've got glucose, sucrose, and fructose. And I don't want to confuse you, but those are the 3 basic sugars. Glucose are your low-hanging fruits. Okay, sucrose and fructose being the most complex, and then sucrose coming in a close second. You've got to have something to cut those chains, or you wind up with some leftover sugars. So sometimes a sugar wash doesn't like to ferment all the way down because those chains have not been broken. But this angel yeast tends to break those and we do not produce as much hydrogen sulfide gas as we normally would with just Distiller's Active Dry Yeast. Okay, boom, those are my findings. I'm extremely happy with that, and I will probably use some Angel and Distillers together from this point on. The dosage I use for a 5-gallon or a 21-liter batch, okay, this is the dosage I found that suits me perfect, and that is 2 teaspoons, 1, 2, and that's about 15 grams if you want to weigh it out, of Angel yeast, 1 teaspoon of Distiller's Active Dry Yeast, which is about 5 grams, because Daddy yeast is heavier than Angel yeast, or not as heavy as Angel yeast. So it's 5 grams for one, and it's 15 grams for 2 teaspoons of Angel yeast. And then I usually put in 1 teaspoon in a small fermenter and 2 teaspoons of yeast nutrient in a larger fermenter if and only if it is a sugar wash. Because in a sugar wash, you are lacking a lot of nutrients and a lot of minerals that are necessary for yeast health and production. Whereas if you're using a grain, if you're using a malt extract, if you're using a fruit, there are plenty of nutrients available where yeast nutrient is not absolutely necessary, but it doesn't hurt, okay? It doesn't hurt. All right, so that's what I've got in all of these. Now, what takes place? Here's, we've already talked about how do I know when it's done? So that should help you along the road. Now remember, you've got 3 items in a fermenter that are necessary, absolutely critical in order for fermentation to take place, and that is fermentable sugar, water, and yeast. Okay? Now, you need them in the proper proportions. We did a video on this some time ago about what happens when you get too much sugar. And what we found was anything over 2 pounds per gallon was more sugar than is necessary, because what takes place is that you create an environment that is unhealthy for yeast propagation. Okay, we found that somewhere around 1.5 pounds is a good data point to start with when it comes to the sugar, table sugar in particular, in water when you add yeast. Now, we also find that a maximum gravity of about 1.090 almost ensures the health of your fermentation. Of course, a little bit lower is a little bit more healthy because you have what? You have water. What happens when you have these 3 basic items? Oh, this is beautiful. You have fermentable sugar, you have water, and you have yeast. Well, fermentation takes place, and it starts to happen. And as long as those proportions are balanced, it will ferment all the way through the entire process until all the sugars are gone. And then all you have left is ethanol and water. Okay, what happens when you have an imbalance? As an example, your water content starts to drop because your yeast are eating sugar and converting that to ethanol, and so your water level drops below what's required for your yeast to be active. Well, you have now what's known as a stuck fermentation. So your yeast go dormant, they drop out. And what they're waiting for is it's just like what happens if they run out of food. They just drop out. They don't die, they just drop off and they wait. If you refeed them or you reintroduce more water, well, then they come back to life and then they continue to propagate and they continue to convert sugars into ethanol and CO2. So when it comes to a stuck fermentation, about 98% of the solution this normally works for about 98% of the time, at about 98% of the time. If you separate that fermenter into 2 different buckets and then fill them with water, they'll come right back to life and it'll finish up. Or remove a gallon or 2 and then reintroduce water. What you're doing is you're raising the water level up to a level where it is more hospitable for your yeast to function. Now that's one thing you can do. The other one, which doesn't happen as often, but it does happen, is when the temperature drops. And if you allow the temperature to drop below 68 degrees or so, in most cases, not in every case, but in most cases, your yeast, which are very, very sensitive, will drop out and stop eating. Their environment has become inhospitable, so they just drop out. And what are they waiting for? They're waiting for you to heat that mash back up or that wash back up. So those are the two things that normally take place. It's either a lack of water, which is almost always the case, or a drop in temperature. But if you get those two balanced, you have a guarantee. Well, yeah, you have your own personal guarantee that your fermentation will start and will end at the appropriate levels. Now, how long does it take? We hear this all the time. How long does it take to ferment? Well, I'll tell you what, it takes as long as it takes. If you've got, think of it like this. If you sat down and someone gave you a plate full of, the small hamburgers, small sliders, and they put 3 sliders on that plate, it probably wouldn't take you long. You can munch them down relatively quick. Now, if they set you down, they put down a plate of 12 sliders, it would take you considerably longer to eat all 12 of those as opposed to would to eat 3 of them. So kind of think of it like that. So if you have a lot of sugars, if you have a really high gravity and you add yeast, it's going to take a while. That's why we say 7 to 10 days. Sometimes it'll take 14 days. Sometimes it'll take 19 days. It all depends at that point on temperature, water, and how much sugar was available at the very beginning. All right? Yeah, hey, I've heard of fermentations taking as short as 2 days. Well, if you have a really, really low sugar content, it doesn't take long for all those yeast, once they develop that colony, to eat all that sugar and it's gone. And all you've got left is ethanol and water. All right. Oh, I hope that answers almost all of the questions except for the very last one. What do I do once it's finished? You've got 2 options here. All right. Your 2 options are, you can first allow gravity to work in your favor, and once it finishes, degas it. And to degas it, what you're trying to do is get all that, you know how a Coke, if you open a Coke and let it sit, that all the CO2 leaves, it goes flat? Well, there's always just a little bit of CO2, residual CO2 that's captured inside that Coke, and if you shake it, a little bit more comes out and a little bit more until it goes totally flat. Well, the same thing happens in a fermenter. You've got a bunch of CO2 still trapped inside here. So all you got to do is you got to agitate it. And you can agitate that by using a whisk and whisk it, and it'll foam up, a bubble. It'll continue to do that until all of that CO2 has been released. That's the first thing that you do. And then you allow gravity to work in your favor. And if gravity works in your favor, everything should fall out to the bottom. That could take as long as 2 weeks. Totally up to you. Or you could use some additives like bentonite, which is nothing more than a clay, which collects everything and it all settles down to the bottom and it'll pull all of those solids out. You can use Instaglass, which is really, really a good product for beer. Irish moss. Irish moss is also used in beer brewing. You can use Keosol and chitosan. Those are 2 chemicals you put in together at different times, and they do the same thing. They will coagulate everything and cause it to drop to the bottom. I've even used non-flavored Jello, the Jello powder, where you prepare that in hot water and get that mixed up and just add that to it, and then that will also settle to the bottom and pull all those solids out. So that's the process of clarifying, or what do we call that? Yeah, I know the guy in the back is probably falling asleep by now. That's our secondary fermentation. Because remember, no fermentation happens in the secondary. It's really clarifying. Why don't we just call it what it is? We're clarifying, okay? We're allowing all the solids to drop out. Because the danger in leaving a solid suspended and floating around increases the danger of scorching in a still, making it look really, really nasty in a bottle if you're making beer or wine. You clarify it. The cleaner it goes into your still, the cleaner it comes out of your still. Okay? That's all I've got for you today. I hope we've unlocked some of the mysteries of measuring some new products, some yeast that I've just started to mess around with, and I got some great results. So hopefully your results are equal to the results that I have, and I've been able to reduce that level of, damn, that smells like ass, out here in the shop. And I've got all of these fermenting at different levels, at different stages, and over a period of time, we're going to run these in our large still and see what we get out of them. We also, remember, we discussed the differences between a proof and trail hydrometer and a standard hydrometer. And of course, we've answered the 3 questions we started off with, which is, when is it done? How do I know? What do I do about a stuck fermentation? And what's this about clarifying? What do we do with the fermentation after it's done? If I haven't answered those, go back and watch this video again. Happy distilling.